Hi, this is Roger Saxano. Thank you for joining the ABPMP's BPM CBOK seminar series. This is chapter 9 of 10. I'll be introducing Dan Morris, who will be covering chapter 9, which is the enterprise process management. Let me quickly introduce myself, and then I'll go through a couple of housekeeping items, and then introduce Dan, and then Dan will take it from there. So again, my name is Roger Saxano. I'm a senior manager at Ernst & Young. I have 22 years of experience focused on BPM strategy, assessment, and implementation. I'm also a contributor author to the ABPMP CBOK, along with a co-author with actually Dan on an article around BPM COE. I've spoken around BPM in webinars and at conferences, and I'm also certified as a business process professional. So a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce Dan. And if you can, please hold your questions to the end. If you can keep your phones on mute. Also, if you have questions you want to put into the session, please keep them simple, so one question at a time. The webinar is recorded, so after the session is done, it will be posted on the ABPMP's website. And this webinar is based off the ABPMP's BPM CBOK version 3. So if you are a member of the ABPMP, you can actually download it for free from the website. So let me now introduce Dan. So Dan Morris, who actually had the honor of actually working with in the past, and again, I mentioned I worked with him on an article also. He's a managing principal at Wendon Consulting. He has more than 25 years in business and IT operational transformation and management. He is absolutely recognized as an expert on BPM in the industry, U.S. and abroad. He's worked on 4 books and published them on business transformation. He has more than 50 papers and articles that he's published, and he's also spoken internationally. He's a member of the board of the ABPMP. He has co-authored the practitioner's certification test for the Common Book of Knowledge. And he's also a certified business process professional and also a certified business architect. So Dan, please, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Raju. For those that have joined past webinars in this series on the CBOK, you'll recognize this chart. For those of you who are new, what this is meant to show you is the efforts that were produced, or the efforts that led to the production of the version 3 of the ABPMP Common Body of Knowledge. There were over 20 people involved in it, and we went through great lengths to make sure that everything that's in the CBOK was checked. And so it ultimately became more than just the opinion of the authors. It became a collaborative effort and a collaborative opinion. Now, today we'll be looking at the 9th chapter, which is Enterprise Process Management. And we're talking about some of the key concepts in moving to process management. We'll be following the general order that these topics are presented in the book, which are shown in the bold text on the left. Now, one of the things that is clear as we start to move into this discussion is that when you start to look at process, it's different than organization. And it really does not align to an organization structure. We'll be getting into that a lot more in just a few minutes. But it's more of a cross-organization, cross-function look at activity and how that activity aggregates. The other thing is, because of that broad view, that enterprise-type view of activity, the process will weave around within the company, at times outside the company, and can include collaborative partners. It could include suppliers. It could include different people that you've outsourced different things to. So it's really a holistic and very broad view of the activity in a company. And one of the issues that we always have when we talk about process deals with the definition of what a process is. And at ABPMP, we look at process as being a cross-functional aggregation of work that delivers a product or a service. And in doing so, the activities are, first of all, a combination of work for multiple business units that happen in a certain sequence to deliver a certain product or service which is value to the customer. We've already talked about it being a cross-functional aggregation of activities, but a process is clearly started by either an event or some time element. It will then run through the organization. Processes are fuzzy. They're not just a clean flow of activity. They touch other processes. They interact with other processes. They interact with processes both within and outside of the company. So as you start to look at process management, it becomes very important to understand how that process functions, to understand how it's supported by internal IT, by external services, and how it all comes together then to deliver that service. Because as we move forward and we start to talk about this, one of the key aspects of process management gets into performance management. And understanding how the process performs really is predicated on understanding the process itself, its components, and how it works. Now, the concept of process management itself isn't new, but it's something that is still somewhat rare. And it's somewhat rare because of the fact that in order to move to a process management approach, you're creating a matrix, and you're putting that matrix on top of the normal organization structure. And whether you want to call it parallel to it, on top of it, or whatever terms you want to use, it's something it's a structure that's in addition to the typical structure. But in addition to it, I mean, it's separate from it, but it now looks at managing activity across all the different organization units that contribute some work, some end product, some assembly to the overall process and the end products of that process. So managing it includes work definition, problem remediation, performance management, governance, and improvement design. And we'll be talking more about improvement design in just a minute, but one of the key areas or key aspects of managing by process is you can now have a very different perspective of improvement. At the process level, you can really start to divide that into, we'll say, ongoing improvement, which would be continuous improvement, performance-related improvement, innovation-related improvement, technology-related improvement, and it all takes on a very different perspective because of the scope that you're dealing with. Whereas the traditional approach where you look within a given business unit and create essentially support for the activities within that business unit have been the way we've always done it. Now, when you start to look at process, you can start to re-aggregate that support. You can start to look at it differently. You can start to look at performance differently, and you can start to look at problem resolution differently, and the ripple effect of those resolutions very differently. So, when you start to have an end-to-end view of activity, you can now have a complete, really for the first time, a complete picture of how all that activity comes together to deliver the service or the end product to the customer. And that also includes customer interactions along the way. and a variety of different functions that are controlled not only by internal standards and rules, but by legislative standards, rules, compliance reporting requirements, and a variety of things. But when you start to look at them in the context of a process, you can now start to see relationships that you couldn't see before when you were starting or looking at it from an individual business unit perspective. Now, excuse me. One of the things now is in doing that, you can start to look at performance measurement, and you can start to roll that up and start to aggregate that and look at how you would look at performance and how you look at problem analysis across the entire spectrum, which then lets you leverage Lean, lets you leverage Six Sigma, and a variety of other approaches to maturity modeling, maturity management in a variety of different ways. So it gives you a great deal of flexibility in how you approach problem resolution, how you approach performance management that you don't have when you're dealing with individual performance at the business unit level. Now, the place to start is in moving to this matrix in this overlaid environment really is where we look at what that process really is. We need to understand it. We need to understand its problems. We need to understand support. And we need to understand the holes in that support and how it all comes together. That allows us to, first of all, identify all of the business units that contribute to the process. And if we're going to be managing the overall process, we really need to know what all those pieces are and how they come together to provide the overall end product. But we also need to be able to drill down into those individual business units and control the prioritization of certain types of improvement work that they're doing, certain types of problems that they're doing, the resolution of those problems. So, okay, I now have another thing that looks like I'm having some more technical difficulty here. Okay. Hopefully you're all still hearing me. So when I apologize for the technical difficulties that we're going through, but we'll kind of just push our way through this, and hopefully they'll get behind us. The key to creating this foundation is once we understand who's involved, what those business units are, we understand how it all fits together, who, what, when, why, and where, and how of it, we can then start to put together a process management committee. And that committee needs to be formed from the different department managers, business unit managers who are involved, so that each feels that they have a contribution and a say to what's going on. It's something that sounds easy, but it's really difficult to do because everyone has their own priorities. Everyone has their own way of being measured. And so what you're now trying to do is to essentially become a statesman and deal with these people and, trying to get everyone to cooperate with everyone else, which can be difficult with conflicting priorities. But we also then recognize that we have to deal with, and we can now as part of this foundation, set up a way to deal with the overall approach to performance management, both at the process level and then coordinating and aligning it down to the individual business units and their contribution to that performance. We can look at how are we going to manage that, what are the key performance indicators that we're going to be looking at, how do those relate down to each of the individual business units and their contribution to the overall process. Where do we get the data for that? How are we going to measure it? What are the formula? And that's where the process committee comes in, because if we can't get concurrence on how we're going to measure performance, then we really are not going to have any way of really dealing with performance issues, because we're just going to have disagreement on the results of the management and the measurement. Fragmentation, we can start to build different support mechanisms and put those mechanisms in place, and we can then start to look at collaboratively how are we going to work together to improve the overall performance of the project itself. Now, as part of this, we really at this point we need to start to look at moving beyond the enterprise process management concept and look at how we instantiate it within the business. How do we do it? How do we make it reality? And the remainder of the discussion is really going to start to look at how we actually move from the conceptual that we've been talking about to the actual physical and how you really get through it and how you really do it. As we've been talking about, you are now allowed to have a very different perspective. And the perspective puts, instead of the business unit at the center and the management of that business unit at the center of activity, we now put process at the center of activity. And the business unit, from a process perspective, becomes subordinate to the considerations, the concerns, the requirements of the process itself. Now, in doing that, you now have somewhat of a conflict, and that's where the statesman aspect of this comes in. And that's one of the reasons it's very difficult to do this, because you're dealing with people, you're dealing with turf issues, you're dealing with requirement issues, you're dealing with responsibility issues, and you're dealing with them with a variety of people that don't necessarily have to go along with what the process manager is asking for. So in this matrix, it's a type of thing where theoretically whatever is done has to be to everybody's benefit as well as then to the company's benefit through the process. The obstacles, well, we've talked a little bit about turf issues and politics. In addition to that, we can have a big impact on compensation systems as we start to make these moves, and because compensation systems always are tied to performance and performance management, performance measurement. So as we start to look at layering on a different type of performance, we still have all the performance issues that we're going to have within the business unit, but we now have a whole new set of them. And which is subordinate to what's more important than the others? There are a lot of issues then from a compensation standpoint that needs to be put in place. And an example of that really is if you want to promote, we'll say the collaboration at the process level, then you would want to strengthen the compensation system, the evaluation, the performance evaluation at the process level. If that's not the focus, then you would keep it at the individual business unit level. So the way that you deal with those compensation systems can have a definite and fairly dramatic impact on the willingness of people to cooperate with one another at the process level. The other thing, it's a real obstacle is that you're now dealing with different type of disruption. Whereas before, a business unit manager could control everything that's going on within that business unit, you now have a different set of change factors driving different types of activity, different improvement activity and problem resolution, and the way those things happen within a business unit. Because now from a process perspective, you need to consider the ripple effect, and you need to consider how what you're doing in an individual business unit is going to affect upstream and downstream in the process. So it requires a very different way of looking at things. And, you know, a lot of times different organizations, we'll say, resist change and resist moving to anything they're not comfortable with. So the key, though, to, we'll say, making these moves and moving people into this type of activity is that the process, first of all, the processes need to be known and shared with everybody in each of the organization units so that they understand the overall process, they understand the problems, the issues, the performance measurements, all of those types of things that you're dealing with at the process level. And you're also then starting to look at how you communicate and how you all interact with one another and how it all fits together. Okay. Now, oops, I hit the wrong thing. There we go. The transition to a process management way of looking at the business operation is, first of all, you know, there's a requirement that you sell the concept to the executive committee, and then once the executives have bought in, you sell it down to the business managers. This is something that is very difficult to try and do from the bottom up, where, you know, you just essentially start to put some things together and then build upward and present a new way of doing things to executive management based on success that's already happened within the organization. Moving to an enterprise process management, because of the holistic view and because of the way that you're now crossing organization lines, crossing function lines, you may be going inside and outside of the company to suppliers and collaborative partners. In order to pull that together, it really has to start at the executive level. And so the foundation, the first foundation element, is the ability to bring the executive management senior board on essentially to bring them into agreement with the approach that we want to do. You then would work on essentially a pilot to make sure that's going to happen in a way that you can repeat. And you'd also, in that pilot, would also suggest that anybody who's interested in moving to a process management approach, seek out others that have done that. It's a journey. It's not really an endpoint because you're always looking at how you can do this and how you can expand it. One of the things that ABPMP could be used for is to help in that search. You know, we've got a lot of mechanisms that allow our members to contact and talk to one another. And so that type of interaction, I think, can be extremely valuable. The foundation, though, in order to get it going, in order to put together something that you can sell to executive management, really need to start by identifying why you want to do this. What's the value of it to the company? And, you know, it's not always easy to define, and as you're starting to move into it, that's where talking to other companies that might be a little farther ahead than you are might become valuable, because they might be able to help you define the value that this is going to be. You know, overall, you know, the value proposition, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it deals with the ability to have an enterprise view of what's going on, to have a different type of planning at the process level, a different way of tying that planning then into strategy to deliver that strategy through the processes as opposed to strictly through the organization. And an ability then to deal with costs very differently as you start to look at costs and you start to look at activity across a process, whereas in an individual business unit, activities may seem necessary. When you start to look at it from a process perspective, you'll have another opportunity to look for redundancies. You'll have another opportunity to look for holes, support opportunities, and different things. So when you start to roll it up and start to look at process, you get another hit from a cost reduction perspective, from a quality improvement perspective, and an overall opportunity to look at how you're interacting at various points in that process itself with the customer. How are you providing value to that customer? What's the customer profile? Are you dealing with the same customer throughout the process? Or does the buying group change at different points in time? And you'll be able to start to address all those different things so that you can then start to look at how do I then increase my market share? How do I then continue to reduce my costs while at the same point in time I'm improving the quality of the product and the desirability of the product? Okay. Now, and moving into the process management, one of the first things that you need to look at is, as you start to pull this together and you start to define things, you'll find that you're at different levels of what they call process maturity. Now, there are quite a few different process maturity models. I understand there are upwards of 60 models between the business side and the IT side available in the marketplace. The model that's shown here is really dealing more with IT processes, but there are those that deal with just business, just IT, or a mixture of the two. The model that you follow, the maturity model that you follow, the way of measuring maturity, is a secondary concern to the fact that you pick one, you settle on that one, and that then becomes the standard throughout the organization. If you have multiple maturity models, frankly, it's going to get you nowhere because sometimes they conflict with one another, and what's in level 2 and one model might be in level 3 in another model, and it just becomes real cumbersome. So if you look at the maturity concept and you look at where you are, you quickly realize that moving through these models, moving through these maturity levels is a journey. And that, by the time you get to the top level, you're going to find that you have certain capabilities at that level that allow you to continue to evolve further. What we see in companies as they start to move into process management, start assessing their process maturity, is that they'll have different aspects of the operation at different levels in the maturity model. So you shouldn't expect to, as you start to move into this, to say, oh, geez, you're at level 1 or you're at level 2 or whatever. You'll have some aspects at level 1, level 2, some at maybe even level 3. That's important in understanding because at this point in time, you can now start to look at, in addition to performance improvement, capability improvement. And that capability improvement is tied to the capabilities inherent in those characteristics or factors in level 1, level 2, level 3, etc. So you can now start to look at how you want to mobilize activity and how you want to then improve the overall operation and move through these levels. There will be some things at different levels that are important to you and some things that are of less importance. So as you move through the model, you really don't need to move everything to a level 2 and then everything to a level 3. Those things that are important to you, do first. So you may have things that you're moving to a level 3 or a level 4, and other things you're just leaving behind at a level 2 until later. So it's, whatever makes sense, but the key is that you now have a way to identify what you want to do, where you're at, define how you want to move forward, and then start to put that into your overall process management and put in the appropriate activities and projects needed to help not only improve the process, but improve your capabilities of improving the process. The foundation in moving forward is to be able to, once you've got the things that we've been talking about, the executive sponsorship, all of those capabilities in place, you now have to enable the activity. So here's where you would start by defining process management. What is it? You define your process management committees. You identify your process managers, and you identify your process owners. You would have, at this point, clear, visible, and that visible is important, executive commitment. Because if you have executive commitment that's not visible within the company, a lot of people won't believe what you have. So that visibility becomes critical in moving forward. And defining your roles of those people who are going to be involved, and I think I'm losing my voice again. You'll look at your RACIs, and you'll also define who does what, when do they do it, why do they do it, how do they do it, not only on the committees, but also within the overall process itself, at the manager level in the different business units, and then at the operation or execution level within those business units. So you can now, as you start to look at problems, you start to look at different changes that are mandated by government policy, regulation, by opportunity within the industry, you can start to now see that process manager can now start to see what has to change within that process itself and who's going to be involved in that change. So this is the foundation element of understanding those roles and those responsibilities becomes absolutely critical. The other thing that is absolutely critical, and I'm not going to go through the whole list here, you can certainly, I'll be happy to send you a copy of the slides, or you can get them through the ABPMP website. But you'll see that we have several different things that deal with rules of governance, and then they deal with rules of and different ways to look at performance measurement, the criteria, the formula, the data, those things that you need. Performance measurement at the process level becomes very different than performance measurement in the individual business unit, because here you're worried about the health and the effectiveness and the efficiency of the overall entity, the process itself. As it winds into the company, out of the company, uses external resources, internal resources, how does that all come together? How is that all coordinated? And in those handoffs, which are tough to control, the timings and all of the things that start to enter into that, all become part of your performance management at the process level. So the degree of difficulty, the degree of complexity can be 10 times as much as it is at any of the given business units. So that's something that has to be recognized and has to be dealt with as an enablement foundation level capability as you start to move forward into your process management perspective on on looking at how you want to control things. You'll also need a training plan, and you'll need for proper transformation funding and planning. We'll talk about planning in a little while. We'll talk about roadmap. One of the key things dealing with executive commitment, first of all, we talked about visible commitment. The second thing we need to talk about is financial commitment. The third thing then that we need to talk about relative to that is a commitment, a strategic commitment that will outlast managers. Some companies that I deal with have pretty much a turnover of the executive staff every 3 to 5 years. As you start to move into process enablement, and you start to look at enabling the overall process management and performance execution at the process level, it's going to take a while. You're not going to deal with this and do this in 3 months. It's literally going to take, with all the processes in the company, as you move from process to process to process, gaining momentum, gaining experience, gaining credibility as you move forward, you're going to evolve the organization, and that's going to take a fair amount of time. A larger organization is going to take a lot of time. So what you need is an ability to have this program outlast the individual senior managers. So it becomes a strategic initiative in moving forward that is guaranteed funding and guaranteed commitment for a long enough period of time to actually implement, to actually do it. The process governance aspect is, obviously it deals with performance management, but it also deals with the organization and the coordination of work through all the different business units that are going to be involved. The governance aspect of process management really starts with the definition of rules, whether you want to call them the rules of engagement or the process governance rules, whatever you want to call them. You have to define how are you going to look at governance. How somebody is going to be responsible for the overall performance of that process. In doing that, you're going to have to define standards. You're going to have to define ways of interacting with each other. You're going to have to define responsibility. And you're going to have to define ways that you can enforce those rules that that committee comes up with. The rules will evolve. The committee will first of all come up with a fairly simplistic set of rules, and then based on need, based on experience, those rules will evolve. The instantiation of those rules is the foundation of process governance itself. So as you start to move forward, okay, that process governance will evolve. Now, all of that governance is based on different models of the process. You need to know how it's working. You need to know how you're managing it. You need to know how you're measuring it. You need to know the quality of the data, and the list goes on. All those things become the foundation for performance management and process governance. Now, governance is always a trade-off between control and flexibility. You can control it to the point where everything just slows down, or you can be flexible to the point where there's really no governance. Finding that balance will be different in each organization, and it will depend on negotiating that position, that line, where that trade-off is with the managers who are involved in supporting that process. So there's no clear answer. It really is a negotiated point or a negotiated line. And the ultimate objective is really a balancing between, what you need from a measurement standpoint and how you're moving forward against those measurement criteria to deliver your objectives, to deliver the standards, the targets, and the problems that you're having in doing so. And so that'll change. That needs to be flexible. It needs to be able to change over time. Now, we talked a little bit before about the new roadmap to look at how you're going to, first of all, start moving towards enterprise process management, And then how are you going to evolve that as you learn more over time and as you see different things happening in the marketplace that you have to react to as a process manager? Well, the roadmap, first of all, needs to be tied to your business strategy. It needs to support where the business wants to go. And it needs to then take that, look at how the organization, how the overall company is changing, the direction that it's headed in, the markets that it's going to be in, the products, and how all those things are now going, those changes are going to affect the process that you're managing. Because you really need to look at it a process by process by process basis. Now you can have overall responsibility for groups of processes roll up, but you're really managing at the individual process level itself. The reason to roll up is if you have a tightly integrated group of processes that are real fuzzy and integrate with each other an awful lot, it might make sense to roll them up and do that both at the process and the process group level. But assuming for right now, we'll just be dealing at the process level, we need to start to look at how those processes are going to be affected by strategy, how they need to change in order to support that strategy. That change can now be driven down into the individual business units because you know what elements of the overall process are contributed to by each of the business units. You know how that process can change, so you now know what each of those business units that are going to be involved in that needs to change in order to support the process change. Will roll on up then to support the strategic change. The overall roadmap, as we said before, represents a strategic commitment by the company simply because of the length of time that it's going to cover. Now, what that also means is that you have to build in, I'd like to say a semi-annual, but at least an annual review of the business process management roadmap to see what strategically is changing, because business strategy changes based on a lot of external factors, everything from market opportunities to legislation. And it also changes based, and to a large degree, on the skill sets that are available in the marketplace. So what major actions do you need at what points in time, and how do those major actions then start to change as your strategy evolves, as that rolls down through your process, and then down to your individual business units? How's that all tied together, and how's that change happening? One of the big drivers of change is automation capabilities. Today, you may not have the ability to do social media. I just throw that out as an example. Well, tomorrow you might, as that starts to happen. And today there may be no plans in IT to happen, but maybe next year there will be. Since we're dealing with a multi-year roadmap, that'll have an effect. That'll have an effect on the processes, on the way those processes change, on the way those processes interact with the customer, on the profile of the customer. So you really need to consider this map as, we'll say, semi-solid. And it'll be solid for a given period of time, and then you're going to formally change it. And you'll be able to identify why you're going to change it, the impacts of those change on activity, on projects, and on funding, and then present that to management in a way that is organized, professional, coordinated, and provides them the information they need to make those decisions. Okay, I'm going to pick up the pace here just a little bit. One of the things that helps you with process, we'll say process management enforcement, is a process management center of excellence. Now, a center of excellence is really just a place where you concentrate certain types of knowledge, certain types of expertise in the company. And the Center of Excellence is normally responsible for interacting with other centers of excellence and others within the company. As an example, I would expect a process management center of excellence to interact with IT, interact with production, start to track what's going on in the marketplace, interact with the process managers, process management committees, looking at how things are changing, looking at the rules and how those rules are changing from the management committee, and looking at how approaches are changing, and then taking those and standardizing them so that people in the different business units will have a consistent way of looking at not only policy, but a consistent way of looking at change, a consistent way of looking at how they all interact together and how they interact with the process side and process management, the process managers, and the process management committee. So the key here, really on this slide, is that it'll work with the appropriate people, create the appropriate standards to avoid overlap, conflict, and lack of clarity. Once you have that clarity, that then feeds into governance, which helps you then look at execution quality, and it helps you identify problems, and it helps you then figure out how those problems can be resolved. And it's through that clarity that you keep everybody moving together on a common path in a collaborative way. Now, I said before that we would talk a little bit about benefits, and I've got just a couple minutes to talk about this now. The key benefit is really consistency, and that's consistency of how you're going to look at that process, how you're going to measure performance, how you're going to manage it, how you're going to start looking at support for it, because I would submit that you have an opportunity to totally take a different look at how IT is supporting the process as opposed to at the individual business unit levels, where those holes are and what needs to change, what the ripple effect is. So you have the ability to look at things at a higher level and from a very different perspective, a much broader perspective. And what's the role of an enterprise process architect in this transitioning? Enterprise process architects, actually, the process architects play a critical role in defining what those processes are. Now, there's a variety of approaches that can be used to identify the processes. One of the approaches is to look at a very high level what are the functions, and then break those down into sub-functions and whatever, and ultimately you get down to process. Those are the people that are absolutely, the foundation of looking at what your processes are, what they're comprised of, how they're managed, and the performance requirements and the way that performance is measured. So they have a significant and very serious role, and I would really not want to do this without those people. The process managers deal with the management of that stuff. By the way, my network connectivity is lost again. But those people are key in getting this going.
There's a question that says, should the process manager have higher power than the directors of business units of the organization?
The answer is that the process manager has no power. The process manager, in the matrices, the matrixed organizations that I've seen, the individual business units managers really control what goes on within those business units. The process manager has authority only from the context of the rules that have been enacted by the process committee. So those managers really are the ones that set those rules and look at how they're all going to be interacted with and how what their roles in that interaction is going to be. So it's really not a question of authority, one group being over the other because they're separate. The process manager really has to go to, if he can't resolve an issue, then he has to go up, first of all, to the committee, and if that doesn't work, then he has to go to the process owner and get that resolved. So directly, it's really not an issue of authority over one another. It's collaboration with the ability then to move on to higher authority. Next question.
Great. And Fernando says, here in Europe, particularly in Portugal, the lobby of technology companies is very strong. IBM, Oracle, Microsoft, they all present themselves to customers as suppliers of miracles, delivering BPMs as a solution to all kinds of problems. With your experience, how do you suggest helping customers who ask us for help and want refocus for its management process as an alternative to technology installed? And if you want me to reread that, I can.
Well, let me. If I don't answer it, then tell me where I left what I left out. Okay.
Sure. We'll have Fernando let us know. Okay.
Okay. The bottom line is that the technology companies want to sell product. They want to sell computers, and they want to sell telecommunications, and they want to sell software. They sell tools. I look at all technology as a toolbox. They don't really sell solutions. You use the tools to develop solutions. So from that standpoint, I really don't look at the technology companies, whether it's the big ones like IBM or smaller ones like No Magic, as providing the solution. They provide the ability to define a solution, and that's really how they should be viewed, in my opinion. Now, as those solutions deal with process, first of all, I would submit that you have to ask them what they mean by process and align their definition to the definitions that we've talked about today. Because I find a lot of the technology companies look at technology processes and not really business processes. A lot of the technology companies, regardless of the fact that they may or may not have management consulting arms, really don't understand the business side. They understand the technology side. So you need to look at the technology, and you need to look at it within that context. Did I answer the question?
I haven't heard from Fernando, so I'm guessing. Yep, he just said yes. Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Dan. All right, so the question from Cecil is, should the matrix organization be a strong matrix with clear assignments and responsibilities?
Absolutely, otherwise it won't work. As soon as ambiguity rears its ugly head, at that point the debate starts and everything just falls apart. So it really has to be a strong organization, and that's where the rules come in. Now, the caveat to that is it's not going to start out as strong as it's going to evolve to. So, you really need to have a little bit of patience, and everybody recognize that on day one, it's really not going to be where it needs to be, and that's where that whole evolution through the maturity model comes in. And that's why, that deals with the capabilities, and it's then as those capabilities change, you can then start to look at how you want to change the rules of engagement, how we'll say the process is going to be measured and how it's going to be managed, and how you're going to use that information. I would submit that if that information is used in a punitive way, you've just lost everything. So it has to be used in a constructive way, and everybody has to believe that it's going to be used in a constructive way versus a punitive way. So those are some of the key things that will start to happen as you start to evolve. Next question.
Great, Dan. The next question is, will you please define activity? More specifically, functional activity. Is it part, sub-process, or step of the process, or does the activity have the processes?
Well, you know, activity and function and functional activity are kind of like the word process. If you go out to the Business Process Incubator and their website and you look up the word process on their dictionary, last time I looked there were 13 definitions for it. So the way that I look at function is, you know, I apply function, it's kind of like a hierarchy of the use of the word, because I can have business functions at the highest level in the company, and you know, you can break any company apart by 3 or 4 functions, and then you can apply the same term, which really just means something that business is able to do at a given level. And you know, you can apply it at any level within that company. So it's one of those terms that can mean a few different things, and it's one of those things that you really need to define for your organization and use it then across all the organization itself. And I know that that's kind of not a real good way to answer the question. You know, an activity also deals with hierarchy. It's an aggregation of tasks, and tasks are an aggregation of steps. So if you're working your way up from the bottom of the overall hierarchy, I start with scenarios, go to steps, go to tasks, go to activities. Activities then combine to form workflows, which ultimately then align to sub-processes and then on up to process. So that's the way that I deal with it, although there are other definitions also.
Great, thank you, Dan. And Heather has a question, and she's still attending the webinar as well, so if we need a little bit more information from her, we can definitely get that. But her question is, what are the pros and cons of creating an architecture from scratch versus creating from a pre-existing infrastructure?
I think that the pro to doing it is you're not constrained. You're not constrained by history, so that you can then start to, and this gets back to one of the things that Michael Hammer said when he was talking about back in the mid-90s about, you know, don't pave the cow paths, which is just because you do something a certain way now doesn't mean that's the way you need to do it in the future. On the other hand, you have history that you have to deal with. So what I suggest is create an optimal model and then look at your current model and then start to look at how you can move the current model to the optimal state. So by using the two, you can now have a delta, and you can put together a migration plan, and that plan then can be justified. You may not want to move everything. You may just want to move some pieces that really are problematic. So it allows you to take a look at things and justify them. But I would submit that you really need both.
Great, thanks, Dan. And do we have a little bit of time for 1 or 2 more questions, or how much more time would you like to allow?
I feel terrible that we've had all of the technical problems. I'll stay here as long as people will have me.
Okay. And Cecil has a question. How does BPM relate to business architecture?
Well, now that's a classic question. I'm a certified business architect, and I wrote the Business Architect Certification Test for Business Architects Association. So I have one foot in both camps, is the reason I mention that. It's something that no one has really agreed on, so I can only give you personal opinion. And personally, I look at business architecture as sitting at the top of what we need to do, which says, if I have a given business strategy, how does that translate into business change? The business architect is the one that does that translation, and that translation gives us essentially a model of how the business is going to work at some point in the future, and we can call that an outcome model. Call it whatever you want. I call it an outcome. If I deliver the strategy and I deliver the objectives of that strategy and I obtain the benefits, what's the organization going to look like? That's defined by the business architect. And that's your business operating model. It says, I'm going to do these things in China, I'm going to do these things in South America, I'm going to do these things, whatever. Here's how it all fits together. Here's where IT is going to be, and here's how we're going to support it, and all of those types of things. And it also then deals with the realities of that structure. Now that's conceptual. So the business architect, in my opinion, deals at the conceptual level, looking at the business operating model and how the business overall needs to function. Making it reality is the job of the enterprise or business process architect. The job of the quote unquote just enterprise architect, which really is, in my opinion, a technical function, deals then with, how do I support these changes to the organization strategically, and on a tactical level, how do I then support the business redesign as given to me by the business process architect? So that's kind of the way that I view those three sitting together. But the process architect is the one that actually looks at how does the business operation itself really change in order to solve problems, in order to deliver continuous improvement, and in order to help support strategy.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. Mr. Linton Passmore wants to know, how does continuous improvement support business units?
How does continuous improvement support a business unit?
How does continuous improvement support business units?
What's that? Is that last word Unix or unit?
UNITS, units.
Okay. I would, because there's a technology called Unix, so I wanted to make sure of the word.
Right, thank you.
Continuous improvement is one of three parts of change moving an organization to transformation. And as part of that question, I want to, for the last two webinars, I've talked about a paper that I've been writing, and that's evolving an organization to optimization. And that paper is finally coming out next month. I want to thank everybody who has asked me for copies of it. And the reason you haven't gotten a copy is because there have been some delays in the publishing. That's coming out next month, and it's dealing with this continuous improvement as part of moving to optimization is really the tie. But I wanted to thank everybody and for their patience, and as soon as it's published, I'll be sending those things out. For people who haven't asked for a copy yet that would like a copy, you can certainly get to me. I don't know what's on the screen right now. My screen is blank. But my phone number is 630-290-4858. And you can also, I can get to me through ABPMP. I'm the Vice President of Membership. So there are different ways to get to me. And I'll be happy to send you a copy of the paper. Now,
I just want to repeat your phone number one more time. It's 630-290-4858. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. I'm going to just send that to the group real quick as well so they are able to view that on the screen.
Okay, thank you. Now that's only relevant from the standpoint of the question on continuous improvement. Continuous improvement is, in my opinion, it's a way to help focus change to specific benefits. Those continuous improvement projects are typically relatively small, although I can apply continuous improvement anywhere and at any level in the overall hierarchy that we talked about at the process level, sub-process level on down. Most of the time what we see, though, is it's applied within a given business unit. And at that level, it's extremely important because it's a way to reduce cost, it's a way to reduce risk, to improve quality. So it's important. The Six Sigma, essentially monitoring and measuring that one puts in place, can be put anywhere in that hierarchy, typically, though, because application systems are related to individual parts of a workflow, not even whole workflows. You know, it's quite possible in any given workflow to have 3, 4, 5 different systems that people would hit as they're going through that workflow to deliver the subcomponent or part of the overall process output. But, you know, at that level, it becomes important in helping organizations move forward and improve those things. Now, one of the things that it doesn't really help you do is move towards optimization, because it's typically dealt with from an isolated standpoint. So I'm going to fix this problem. The Six Sigma monitoring told me I have an X problem, so I'm going to fix that. And so you don't have a broader context typically. You could, but typically you don't find that. But the bottom line on you know, performance management and continuous improvement is it's a critical component of, you know, helping a business evolve to a better state.
Great, and we had one more question. It is, what are the key components of transition from a business analysis manager to process manager?
Wow. You know, and again, it's definitional. I mean, if you look at IIBA and you look at, you know, the Business Architects Association and you look at ABPMP, you look at OMG, you look at, everybody has their own way of looking at that. So it's one of those things where there's no clear definition, and the definitions that I see are often in conflict. And so the way that you would then move is subject to the definition that you're following. Having said that, I personally look at the business analyst as someone who is more narrowly focused, maybe focused within a given business unit or a given business function. And, you know, the role that they play in there is somewhat similar, but much more narrowly focused than a process level person. So I think that the key difference is, you know, applying a lot of the same things, doing a lot of the same things, but moving up a level of what we'll call abstraction in the company, moving from the purely execution level at the workflow within a given business unit, more as you move then up higher in higher levels of abstraction. And higher, it's just in the model is all I'm talking about. At that point, you start to deal with some different concerns. Your financial concerns become more important. Different ways of measuring things, different considerations. So I would say the only way to really start to do that is to start to interact you know, more at the process level and get projects and things that deal more at a process level than an individual workflow or business unit level.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. Is there anything else you'd like to let the attendees know as we wrap up here?
Just to thank everybody for their patience